The first light of morning crept through the long, arched windows of the Red Keep's library, casting honeyed ribbons across ancient tomes and scrolls, bound in cracked leather. Samwell Tarley, who had never stopped feeling out of place within these walls, even after months in King's Landing, sat hunched over a map of the Seven Kingdoms, his thick fingers tracing the inked lines of forgotten rivers and dusty roads. His spectacles slid down his nose, but he barely noticed. The words absorbed him, as they always had, more comforting than the shouts from the training yard or the thunder of hooves in the stables. Knowledge, he'd learned, could heal more wounds than any sword. He'd grown leaner since coming south, the long walk from the wall melting the soft fat from his cheeks and chin. Yet still, he felt the eyes of the city's courtiers upon him, measuring him, dismissing him, whispering behind his back that it should have been some other Maester, someone with a grander name, a grander lineage, to serve as the Grand Maester of the realm. Yet it was Sam who wore the chain now. Links of Valyrian steel, silver, gold, tin, copper, lead, and obsidian, each a symbol of the mysteries he'd mastered and the ones he still sought to uncover. Sam's appointment had come as a surprise to many, but not to him. He'd seen too much, survived too much, not to understand the power that came with knowledge. He'd seen the Night King fall and the dead swept away, seen dragons wheel above Winterfell, and fire consume the greatest city in the world. He'd watched the old world die and the new one struggle to be born, and he'd learned, sometimes painfully, sometimes quietly, that healing the wounds of the realm required more than just strong kings and sharp swords. The doors to the library opened with a groan. Sir Davos Seaworth stepped inside, his graying beard neatly trimmed, his eyes crinkling with amusement at the sight of Sam. "You've missed breakfast, Sam. Again." Sam looked up, startled. "Oh, I meant to only read for a little while." He adjusted his spectacles, blinking. "It's just, there's a treatise here on the treatment of burning fever in the Riverlands, and another on the winter blight that struck the Reach during King Jaehaerys' reign. I thought there might be something we could use for the city." Davos' smile was gentle, if a little sad. "You're not wrong. People still suffer. The war is done, but wounds take longer to heal." He approached the table, peering down at Sam's map. "You're thinking of sending more healers out into the countryside, if we can spare them," Sam replied, his voice uncertain. "There's been a cough in Flea Bottom. It's spreading faster than we can treat it." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "And there's still the matter of the grain stores. We're feeding more mouths than we can count." Davos nodded, fingers drumming the wood. "I'll speak to the council. You do what you do best." "Then." Sam smiled, grateful, and bent back over the map. The city hummed beyond the windows, the sounds of rebuilding a constant reminder of how close they'd come to ruin. He could almost see the ghosts. The burnt-out shell of the Great Sept, the crumbled manzas along the Street of Silk, the blackened bones beneath the cobblestones, the scars of Daenerys Targaryen's final fury, and Cersei Lannister's pride before that, still marred every stone. And yet, there was hope. Sam closed his eyes and pictured Gilly and little Sam, safe now in Horn Hill, gardens blooming in the spring sun. He thought of Jon, far to the north, carving out a new peace among the wildlings. He thought of Arya, sailing for distant horizons, of Sansa, her crown of white wolf fur gleaming in the snows of Winterfell. The old world was gone, but something new struggled to be born. And Samwell Tarley, once the coward of Castle Black, now bore the weight of that new world's healing upon his own broad shoulders. He rose, smoothing his robe, and left the library behind. The hallways of the Red Keep wound in labyrinthine circles, lined with tapestries faded by smoke and time. Sam's footsteps echoed off the stone as he made his way to the council chamber. There, a small group awaited. Sir Davos, ever the hand in all but name. Brienne of Tarth, clad in steel and patience. Tyrion Lannister, still clever, still haunted. and Queen Brienne, who wore the Iron Throne like a mailed fist within a velvet glove. Brienne looked up as Sam entered, her eyes warm. "Grand Maester Tarly," she greeted, inclining her head. "What news?" Sam fumbled with his chain, nerves rising. "Your Grace, there is illness spreading in the city. I've spoken with the alchemists and the healers. We need to open the vaults, grain and stores of herbs. And," he hesitated, glancing at Tyrion, "there are rumors in the countryside. Starvation. Unrest." Tyrion snorted softly. "Rumors, Sam, or facts?" Sam stood straighter. "Facts, my lord. I have letters from the Maesters of Stokeworth, Hayford and Rosby. The people are hungry." Brienne's mouth tightened. "Then we will feed them." Davos spoke up. "It'll mean taking stores from the Red Keep. The Queen's table will be bare for weeks." "Dantercy." Brienne's blue eyes flashed. "Then let it be bare. I'll not have the city starve while we eat fat and rich." Sam nodded, heart swelling with pride. "I will see it done, Your Grace." Tyrion leaned back, fingers steepled. "And the sickness, Grand Maester?" "We must send healers to every corner of the city," Sam replied. "Quarantine the sick as best we can. Burn the soiled bedding. It will not be easy, but we can save lives." Brienne nodded. "Do it." As the council broke, Sam hurried through the Red Keep, summoning healers, scribes, and servants. The work was endless, exhausting. But he pushed himself harder than he ever had before. He wrote letters to every maester in the Crownlands, urging them to prepare remedies, to send what herbs they could. He coordinated the opening of the vaults, watched as grain was carted through the streets beneath the gaze of sullen, hungry eyes. He found time, late at night, to pore over ancient texts by candlelight, searching for cures, for wisdom. He experimented gently with mixtures of willow bark and elderflower, brewed potions with poppy for the worst fevers. When a young girl collapsed in the street, Sam knelt beside her, cradling her head, whispering soothing words until the fever broke. The city changed, slowly. The cough lessened. The dead were buried, the sick restored. In the countryside, stores of food were delivered beneath the banners of the crown. Children's laughter returned to the markets. And Sam, though he grew more tired with each day, felt something like hope blooming in his chest. One morning, as the sun rose golden and bright above the city, Sam climbed the steps of the Great Sept. It was still little more than a ruin, but scaffolds crawled its skeleton, and the air rang with the hammering of masons. There, in the shadow of what once had been, Sam knelt and prayed. He gave thanks. For his friends, for his family, for the chance to heal the world. He stood, brushing dust from his knees, and turned as a figure approached. It was Brienne, her armor gleaming in the dawn. "You did it, Sam," she said, voice quiet. "You healed them." Sam shook his head, smiling. "Not just me. It took everyone. You, Sir Davos, the council, the people themselves. I just showed them the way." Brienne smiled, rare and bright. Perhaps that is the greatest healing of all. Together they watched the city wake, its wounds fading with each new day. But Sam's work was not done. News came, soon enough, of unrest in the Riverlands. The lords of the Trident squabbled over land left fallow by the wars, and bandits preyed on the weak. Sam rode out with a company of healers and guards, determined to bring peace and knowledge to every corner of the realm. The Riverlands were green and gold in the spring, but scars of war lingered. Sam saw burned villages, fields left wild with weeds, mothers clutching sick children. He stopped at every village, tending wounds, setting bones, giving advice to the small folk. He trained local wise women, shared the secrets he'd learned in Old Town and beyond. Word spread. The Grand Maester rides with the Queen's blessing, and with him comes healing. At Harrenhal, Sam met with Lord Edmure Tully, who wore the weight of his ruined castle like a second skin. They spoke long into the night about healing, not just bodies, but hearts. about bringing together the lords and bannermen, about forgiving old wounds. Edmure wept for the dead, but he listened. And Sam, who had never thought himself a leader, found himself giving counsel, his words shaping the future of the Riverlands. When Sam returned to King's Landing, a year had passed. The city had changed, rebuilt, renewed. There were gardens where ashes had once been, children learning their letters in open squares. The Queen's Council grew, now attended by envoys from the Reach, the Vale, even Dorne. Sam's reputation spread far beyond the city's walls. He received letters from every corner of the realm, questions about medicine, about peace, about how to live in a world that no longer feared the long night. He answered every letter, patiently, with wisdom and warmth. One evening, as autumn winds rattled the leaves in the gardens of the Red Keep, Sam sat with Gilly and little Sam. They shared honey cakes and cider, laughter ringing beneath the stars. Gilly rested her head on his shoulder, and little Sam curled up in his lap, listening as Sam spun tales of dragons and direwolves, of battles won and lost. But it was the tale of the healing of the realm that Sam liked best. It was a quiet tale, full of small kindnesses and slow, patient work. It was not a story of swords or fire, but of hope, the kind that endured. Years passed. The Seven Kingdoms grew stronger, slowly, painfully. There were setbacks. There always are. There were new plagues, new wars, new wounds to mend. But through it all, Samwell Tarly endured, the chain of the Grand Maester heavy upon his shoulders, his heart strong. He watched as little Sam grew into a scholar in his own right, as Gilly found her voice among the noblewomen of the court. He saw the city rise, greater than before, its wounds healed by time and care. On the day of his death, Samwell Tarly lay in his bed, the great chain resting upon his chest. He was old, frail, his beard gone white, but his eyes were bright still. He held Gilly's hand, and little Sam, now a grown man, sat by his side. "Did I do enough?" Sam whispered, his voice thin. "You did more than enough," Gilly replied, tears shining in her eyes. "You healed the world." Sam smiled, his last breath gentle as a sigh. And in the city outside the bells tolled, not for war or death, but for peace. The realm remembered him not as a warrior, but as a healer. As the Grand Maester who mended the wounds of a broken world, who believed that knowledge and kindness could bring light even to the darkest of nights. And so, the story of Samwell Tarly endured, whispered in libraries, sung in halls, cherished by all who knew that true strength was not found in swords or crowns, but in the quiet courage to heal what was broken, and to love without fear. Winter winds howled through the high towers of King's Landing, even as the city below glittered with life and the warm golden glow of prosperity. Years had passed since Samwell Tarly first claimed the chain of Grand Maester. In that time, the Seven Kingdoms had become a tapestry mended by careful hands, the rents and scars of war bound with patient threads of trust, hope, and learning. Yet, as Sam knew too well, wounds beneath the skin could fester even as the outer flesh healed. The lessons of the past haunted him, driving him to work harder, to plan further, to never rest while need remained in the world. The Red Keep itself was different, lighter in spirit, as if the ghosts of its old masters had been soothed and set free. Its gardens thrived, heavy with fruit and blooms, and the laughter of children rang from the courtyards where once only soldiers had marched. The Queen's Council had become as much a gathering of scholars as of lords and ladies, and it was there, in the high chamber overlooking Blackwater Bay, that Samwell sat each day, surrounded by charts, letters, and faces filled with expectation. Brienne still ruled with a fair, unwavering hand, her brow lined by the years, her eyes as clear and honest as they had ever been. Sir Davos, though slowed by age, remained the Queen's trusted hand, his shrewdness undulled by time. Tyrion, now grown less sardonic and more philosophical, wrote treatises on governance and justice, which Sam helped transcribe and distribute to every lord and town council in the realm. Little Sam, now a young man in his 20s, had earned his own maester's chain and oversaw the city's great infirmary. where the sick and hurt found solace in the care his father had dreamed of making commonplace. It was on a cool morning near the turn of the year that troubling word arrived from the north. Samwell, bundled against the chill, unsealed the raven's message and read by the light of the sun slanting through a crystal window. The handwriting was Sansa Stark's, firm, precise, and heavy with worry. The north, though strong, had suffered a hard harvest and an outbreak of shaking sickness in the settlements east of the White Knife. Crops failed. Small folk starved. The old superstitions stirred like dust in the cold. Sam set down the letter, heart tightening with concern. The memory of those old northern faces haunted him, of John, stalwart and silent in the snow, of Dolorous Ead and Gren and all the brothers he had loved and lost. He closed his eyes, breathing a quiet prayer, then summoned a scribe. Within a day, the Grand Maester had arranged the dispatch of 6 wagons from King's Landing's well-stocked granaries, accompanied by a dozen learned healers and 4 casks of the poppy draught he had learned to blend with willow bark and honey for fevers. Letters went out to Old Town and the Citadel, requesting further supplies and the most recent findings on winter illnesses. A second letter, more personal, Sam penned in his careful round hand. Dear Lady Sansa, know that the realm's heart is with you and your people. Relief will come with all haste, and I shall follow myself within the fortnight. Hold fast. Light and learning are on their way. Yours in hope, Samwell Tarly, Grand Maester. When he arrived at Winterfell, bundled in heavy furs, Sam found the great hall much as he remembered. Stone and banners, warmth from the roaring fires, the scent of spiced bread and roasting meat. Sansa greeted him with a weary smile. Her red hair bound in intricate braids, her eyes shadowed with the burdens of rule. Sam, she said, and embraced him, letting the mask of royalty fall for a heartbeat as she pressed her cheek to his. He offered her the gentle, awkward smile that had never quite left him. My lady, it's good to see you. Now lunch. They walked together through the snowy courtyards. Speaking quietly, Sansa spoke of her people, of the difficulties keeping them fed and warm, of the mistrust that crept in with every lost harvest and every fevered child. The North remembers, she said, her voice soft but strong. But the North also grieves, and old grief is hard to heal. Sam understood. In his chambers, he spread out his medicines, teaching the castle's healers how to use each tincture, each salve. He walked among the villages, sharing the simple lessons that could save hundreds. The boiling of water, the importance of clean hands and bedding, the right herbs for fever and cough. Little by little, the shaking sickness waned. Children returned to their games, men to their fields, women to their work. For the first time in weeks, the bells of Winterfell tolled in celebration, not mourning. Yet Sam's heart was not light. As he gazed out at the vast white expanse from atop the battlements, he felt the weight of all he had left undone, of all the wounds that patience and knowledge could not reach. He remembered the wall, now a jagged ruin stretching across the north, and wondered if peace could ever truly last in a world such as theirs. He visited the crypts, where the old kings slept, and there he found Jon Snow. Older, sterner, his hair flecked with silver, eyes lined by time and sorrow. Jon had come south to help settle the unrest, but he seemed uncomfortable in the stone halls, as if he longed for the wild sky and wind of the true north. Sam, Jon greeted him, voice low and steady. You've done good work here. Sansa spoken of nothing else. Sam's eyes grew damp with gratitude. I learned from the best. I learned from you. They walked among the tombs, silent, sharing the memory of all they had endured, the battles and loss, the laughter by the fire, the long march into night and terror. At last, Jon turned to him. You've changed the world, Sam, more than any king or queen. Bow. Sam smiled, brushing snow from a cold marble direwolf. Only because I had friends worth changing it for. Jon smiled in return, a rare, unguarded thing. They parted with a brother's embrace, and Sam promised to return as soon as duty allowed. On the road south, Samwell's company was joined by lords and commoners alike, all seeking counsel or healing. Word of the Grand Maester's journey had spread, and wherever he passed, folk gathered, sometimes to seek help for a sick child, sometimes just to thank him for a loaf of bread, a lesson shared, a kindness offered. More than once, Sam found himself seated by a fireside, telling stories of dragons and the wall to wide-eyed children who clung to every word. It was in the Riverlands, in a tiny hamlet drowned by autumn rain, that Sam found a new wound to heal. The hamlet's Septon, a kindly old man who remembered Sam from a night spent hiding from Lannister soldiers, had fallen ill, leaving the people frightened and aimless. With no one to mediate disputes or offer hope, old feuds had blossomed into violence. Two families, the Plowmans and the Reedwells, stood ready to spill blood over a disputed field. Sam gathered both families in the little sept, now hung with his travel-stained banners, and spoke to them not of laws or retribution, but of memory, of how the land had fed both families in years of peace, how children from each had once played together in the meadows. He quoted songs and histories, speaking gently, asking questions rather than giving orders. At first, anger ruled the hall. Voices were raised, fists shook. But Sam listened, patient as a stone, refusing to judge or shame. Bit by bit, the tempers cooled. The faces softened. The feuding heads remembered shared griefs, a lost brother in one family, a vanished daughter in the other. And slowly, the ice of hate melted. An agreement was reached, land to be shared, and a feast was held in Samwell's honor. He departed in the morning to the sound of singing. One village, one sept, one wound healed. The news spread with him. In each town he saw the same: disputes, old hatreds, fresh hopes. He took every chance to mediate, to listen, to teach. He left behind libraries where there had been none, taught letters to children and adults alike, founded gardens, and healed bodies as well as hearts. Back in King's Landing, Sam found the city transformed. The new infirmary, built beside the old dragon pit, now bustled with healers from every land. Reach Dorne the free cities, even distant Yt. A great school had risen beside it, where any with wit and will might learn to read, write, and count. The queen herself attended lessons, inviting the city's poorest children to dine at her table each week. One day, in the midst of these joys, trouble darkened the queen's council. Word came from Dorne: drought, rebellion, the threat of war. Old wounds festered in the sun, as noble houses fought over water rights and vassalage. Brienne turned to Sam in the council chamber, voice heavy. "Grand Maester, what can be done? Swords won't bring water, nor stop men from dying in the dust." Sam nodded, the links of his chain cool against his skin. "We cannot conjure rain, but we can teach what was lost. In Old Town, I read of the ancient Dornish ways: cisterns, aqueducts, wells deep as mountains. The sand could be made to bloom, if only the lords would share the water." "Now," Tyrion raised an eyebrow. "You wish to heal them by teaching them what their ancestors knew. I wish to help them see that wisdom is stronger than pride." Sam replied. Within a month, he was bound for Dorne, accompanied by engineers and stone masons, letters of peace from the queen, and a promise: any house that shared water would share in the bounty of the realm. There, in sun-bleached castles and wind-swept villages, Sam oversaw the restoration of wells and waterworks, helping the old and young alike dig and build. He read aloud the words of ancient lore, translated from faded scrolls, and gradually, the lords who had been ready to draw swords found pride instead in outdoing each other in feats of construction and generosity. In the end, the wells filled, the crops grew, and the threat of war passed. The Dornish princes wrote to the queen, praising Sam's wisdom and pledging fealty anew. Years passed in this way, each one a new challenge, a new test of patience and faith. In the Vale, Sam helped root out a pestilence in the mountain towns, teaching the lords to build public baths and bring fresh water from melting snows. In the Reach, he broke the stranglehold of the merchant lords by introducing new crops, helping tenant farmers earn enough to keep their lands. In the Westerlands, He reformed the old mines to make them safer, bringing a new prosperity to miners who had once died in darkness and dust. And always he wrote letters. Hundreds, thousands. His words spreading wisdom, comfort, and the unshakable belief that the wounds of the world could heal, if only its people would choose to care for one another. In the quiet moments, Sam found peace in his family. Gilly, ever his anchor, grew beloved by the ladies of the court, her kindness and wit a balm for many a troubled soul. Little Sam, his hands deft with scalpel and salve, became known as the healer of the capital. His fame spread as far as Bravos and Volantis. But Samwell Tarly, Grand Maester, would be remembered not for the chain he wore, nor for the titles and honors that followed his name. He would be remembered for the hope he planted wherever he went, a hope that grew in gardens and schools, in healed bodies and reconciled hearts. The hope that knowledge, wielded with love, could mend even the deepest wounds of war and grief. On the day the Queen died, after a reign remembered for peace and justice, the bells of King's Landing rang out for a week, mourning and celebration bound as one. Sam, white-haired and stooped, spoke the eulogy in the great sept rebuilt by many hands, his words simple but shining with truth. "We are all broken, each of us," he said, voice strong in the cold air. "But together, through kindness, wisdom, and forgiveness, we can make something stronger than what was lost. That is the legacy of our Queen, and the legacy I hope I have served." He lived long enough to see his own son chosen as Grand Maester in his stead, the chains of knowledge passed on. In the silent halls of the citadel, beneath the ancient glass candles, the story of Samwell Tarly's healing of the realm was written in golden ink, not as a tale of great battles or conquests, but as the patient, unending work of love. And in every corner of the realm, where gardens flourished, wells ran sweet, children learned to read, and old hatreds faded in the sunlight, the name Samwell Tarly was spoken with gratitude, and the world, at last, was healed. Aiga. Spring came softly to the Seven Kingdoms, as if the gods themselves desired respite after years of storm and sorrow. For Samwell Tarly, Grand Maester and healer of the realm, the change of season was marked not only in the lengthening of days, but in the deepening calm that had settled over King's Landing and beyond. The air above the city, once thick with ash and smoke, now shimmered with birdsong and the distant laughter of children. Yet, in the quiet that followed peace, Samwell found himself haunted by the fear that the labors of his life could be undone by a single spark of ignorance or cruelty, that the careful latticework of trust he had spent decades weaving might unravel in a moment. He awoke one morning to a knocking at his chamber door, urgent, persistent, but not the herald of crisis he had come to dread in his earlier years. Little Sam entered, tall and calm in the gray robes of a maester, carrying an armful of letters. He was every inch his father's son, though his eyes had a sharper cast, and his voice, when he spoke, was gentle but never unsure. "More ravens from the west, father," little Sam said, placing the stack on the table. "And this, from the Prince of Dorne." He passed a sealed parchment to Sam, who broke it open with trembling fingers. Prince Corric of Dorne wrote in a spidery hand, his words formal but laced with sincere gratitude. The new wells had survived the winter drought, and the once barren villages now overflowed with fruit and grain. "Your knowledge," the prince wrote, "has done what no sword or treaty could. For the first time in generations, we know peace with the Reach and friendship with the Stormlands. My people call the deep wells the Tarly Gifts, and I have ordered a day of feasting in your honor." Samwell felt tears prick his eyes as he set the letter down. It was not pride he felt, nor even relief, but a quiet, humble joy, a knowledge that healing, once begun, could outlast the healer. "Will you reply?" asked little Sam. Sam nodded. "In a moment." He looked out the window, where the city sprawled beneath a sky swept clean by last night's rain. "Tell me, son, have you finished your rounds at the infirmary?" Little Sam smiled. "Nearly. I've been training Mistress Mara to blend the tinctures for the cough. She has a good hand for it, and the mothers trust her." Samwell's chest warmed with pride. "Well done. You'll soon put me out of a job." "Ben?" Little Sam only grinned, but in his eyes there was a question, and perhaps a worry. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up the sword, the title, even Horn Hill?" Samwell shook his head. "I never wanted any of those things. My place was always here. Not in halls of stone nor on the field, but wherever someone needed help." He touched his son's shoulder, thinking of the journey they'd made. From the lonely halls of Castle Black to the sunlit towers of the Red Keep. All he had lost, all he had gained. "Remember, Sam, the world is never truly healed. But every day we choose to mend it matters. That's enough." "Ben?" Little Sam nodded, absorbing the lesson as he had since boyhood. Later that morning, Samwell made his way through the city on foot. He did so often despite the protests of guards and counselors. The Grand Maester's presence in the markets and alleyways had become a common sight. His heavy chain glinting over simple brown robes, his soft words soothing as a lullaby. He stopped by the Queen's School, a sprawling cluster of buildings near the Sept. The Master of Numbers was teaching a group of children to add and subtract with smooth river stones. Beside him, a scepter read from a book of history, one that Samwell himself had compiled, full of tales of unity, mercy, and cleverness. The children listened with rapt attention, and Sam felt again that old swelling hope. Knowledge was a fire that could not be quenched once it caught. It spread from mind to mind, 1,000 small flames in the darkness. Afterward, Samwell walked the winding path toward the dragon pit, now repurposed as a public garden and gathering place. Old stones were overgrown with wisteria, and the scent of earth and leaf filled the air. The infirmary stood nearby, its whitewashed walls bright in the sun, the doors flung wide to admit all who sought healing. There, he paused to help a girl with a broken arm, her mother's tears drying as little Sam set the bone and wrapped it with practiced care. An old fisherman limped in with a festering wound. Samwell cleaned it, murmuring encouragement, and prescribed a poultice of honey and moss. He sat with a woman who had lost her husband to a winter fever, listening to her grief without judgment or hurry. The city had changed, yes, but human pain and hope remained constant. Samwell's service was the thread that bound them, from king to beggar, from prince to orphan. In the afternoons, Sam returned to the keep for council meetings. The room was often lively, Brienne's hair now streaked with silver, but her presence undiminished. Davos still sharp-witted, his voice the first to rise in argument and the last to fade in defeat. Tyrion's jokes growing fewer but cleverer, his letters to distant lords as deft as any swordplay. The council chambers had become a place of laughter and frankness, where even the lowliest scribe was encouraged to speak his mind. On this particular day, the meeting turned quickly to trouble. Rumors of unrest had arrived from the Iron Islands, a new priest of the drowned god stirring the lords to thoughts of conquest, old grievances swelling as barnacles on a hull. Brienne frowned, her broad hands folded on the table. "We cannot allow the Isles to fall into chaos. War there would spread. Old wounds would break open again." Samwell leaned forward. "If I may, Your Grace, these priests thrive when people feel forgotten. The Ironborn have never trusted outsiders, nor cared for the Maester's ways, but they care for strength and for stories. Perhaps we send not swords, but a delegation, someone who knows their customs, who can listen as well as speak." "Bendarwind Shandi." Tyrion nodded. "Let me guess, yourself." Samwell flushed. "If it pleases the council, yes, I have no gift for seafaring, but perhaps a little patience and a few stories of the world outside might ease their tempers." Brienne nodded approval, and it was settled. Within days, Samwell set out with a company of sailors and healers, traveling the stormy, salt-bitten waters to the Iron Isles. The voyage was rough, and Sam spent many days green and miserable, longing for the calm of his library. Yet the moment he set foot on Pike, the ancient seat of House Greyjoy, he felt the old thrill of purpose return. The halls were colder, the faces harder, but the wounds were the same as anywhere. Hunger, fear, pride, and longing. He met with the priests of the drowned god, listening as they spoke of old glories and new grievances. He attended their rituals, neither mocking nor embracing them, but showing respect for their traditions. In quiet conversations, Samwell spoke of the world beyond the sea, of Dorne's new wells, of gardens blooming in the sands, of minds made safe in the Westerlands, of children who read and write and dream of a future without blood. He did not promise miracles, only understanding. Some mocked him, but more listened. A healer is a rare thing on the Iron Isles, and when he treated a chieftain's fevered daughter with herbs and care, their suspicions softened. He met with Lady Yara Greyjoy, now matronly but fierce, and together they walked the cliffs, speaking openly of the dangers and the hopes of their peoples. Samwell proposed a school on Pike, not just for letters, but for seamanship, healing, and trade. Yara was skeptical at first, but when Sam offered to bring Dornish shipwrights and Old Town's finest navigators, she relented. Weeks passed, and by the time Samwell departed, he left behind the beginnings of peace. A wary peace, built on respect and the promise of something better. Ravens soon brought news that the priest had departed for Old Wick. His followers diminished, his threat fading with the tide. Samwell returned to King's Landing with new journals and a mind full of ideas. The council welcomed him home with cheer, and the Queen herself insisted on a feast in his honor. Sam accepted with humility, and that night, as candles burned low in the hall, he found himself at the center of a ring of laughter and stories. Tyrion and Davos arguing over whose adventures were the more foolish, Brienne listening with her rare, radiant smile, and little Sam teasing his father for his seasickness. The world was not perfect, but it was whole. Time moved on as it must. Samwell grew older, his beard and hair whitening, his walk slowed by aches he never thought to complain about. Yet his mind remained keen, and his curiosity insatiable. He completed the great compendium of healing, a book that would come to be known as the Tarly Codex, a work that blended the wisdom of maesters, septons, wise women, and foreign healers from across the world. He presided over disputes, trained new generations of maesters, and expanded the infirmary into the finest hospital in Westeros. He watched as his grandchildren ran laughing through the Red Keep's gardens, as the bells rang in peace from Old Town to White Harbor. And one evening, as the sun slipped below the hills, and the city glowed with the gentle fire of 100,000 candles, Samwell sat on a bench in the gardens, Gilly's hand in his, listening to the murmur of leaves and distant voices. Little Sam, now Grand Maester in his own right, brought news of a birth in Dorne. A girl named Mara, in honor of the healer Sam had once taught. "Your work goes on, father," little Sam said, pride thickening his voice. Samwell looked at his son, at Gilly, at the world he had helped to heal. "No work is ever truly done," he replied, his voice a soft echo of the old godswood. "But each life touched is a light against the dark. That is enough for any man." And so, as the night gathered and peace lingered across the realm, Samwell Tarly, coward, scholar, healer, friend, rested in the knowledge that the world, though wounded and weary, would endure. The memory of his kindness lived on, a seed planted in the heart of Westeros, forever growing toward the light. Years drifted gently onward, and the sunlit peace that Samwell Tarly had helped forge in Westeros endured, maturing into something deeper and more resilient than anyone in the broken aftermath of war had dared hope. The city he called home no longer seemed haunted by the shadows of fire and death. Instead, its streets teemed with green market stalls, the songs of minstrels, the bold voices of women hawking bread and fruit beneath the walls. The Queen's School graduated its first true class, sons and daughters of lords and blacksmiths alike. And these scholars found positions across the 7 kingdoms, overseers of harvests, healers, builders, scribes. For Samwell, age came on gentle feet. His beard had gone white, his hair thin to the crown, but his mind was sharper than ever. Most mornings he awoke before the dawn, walking the paths through the gardens and along the river, Gilly at his side. Often little Sam joined them, sharing new discoveries, a treatise on Braavosi water gardens, a root found in the rainwood that cured persistent cough. The world was still large and strange, and Samwell had taught his son to crave its wisdom. One spring morning, when the first crocuses poked their gold heads through the soil, a new letter arrived from the north. It was from Arya Stark, her hand bold and wild as a mountain river. She wrote from the far ports of Ibn, describing storms and icy seas and a plague that swept through a village, felling strong men and children alike. They have no healers, Sam. And their old ways can't stop the dying. Is there wisdom from the south I could send them? Is there a prayer? Or a salve? Sam smiled at the words, his heart squeezing with pride and a pang of longing. He took up his quill and set about crafting a reply. Painstakingly detailed advice on the boiling of water, the making of willow bark tea, the cleaning of wounds with salt and honey. He included a map for distilling spirits to clean wounds in pages from the Tarly Codex. He ended with a gentle admonition. You are their hope now, Arya. Teach them. Listen. Every life you save is a thread in the new world we have tried to build. Nendero. The reply was sent with the swiftest ship in port, and Sam smiled for days, knowing his words might save strangers across the cold sea. It was not glory nor renown that pleased him, but the spreading of knowledge, a flame carried from hand to hand, shore to distant shore. Back in King's Landing, the business of ruling continued. Queen Brienne had grown older, though her rule remained steadfast. Davos Wit was dry as ever. Tyrion had retired to his vineyard outside Lannisport, sending only rare, pithy letters to the council. Little Sam, now in his 40s and respected in his own right, presided at most council meetings, his calm voice settling disputes before they could erupt. The torch had passed, not with ceremony, but with quiet assurance. Yet there was always work for the Grand Maester. The long peace brought its own problems. The population grew, and with it, the city's hunger, its thirst for clean water, its need for medicines and schooling. Samwell worked with the Queen's builders to design new aqueducts, oversaw the training of midwives and physicians, and wrote handbooks for every steward and bailiff from the Arbor to the Dreadfort. He traveled still, often with Gilly, sometimes with a grandchild or two in tow. In Old Town, he helped restore a hospital long shuttered by war, training a new generation of healers from among the city's orphans and bastards. In the Westerlands, he settled a strike among miners by persuading their lords to adopt safer methods. Methods he'd first read about in a Valyrian scroll, dusty and long forgotten. In Dorne, Sam and Gilly rode camels through the dunes, their caravan guided by the grandchildren of those who had once called him stranger. They brought seeds for drought-hardy crops, instructions for deep wells, and new stories to share in market squares. Sam's fame had grown, and though he felt a little embarrassed by the adulation, he could not help but feel hope when he saw children reading his codex beneath the orange trees, or healers in sun-bleached robes mixing herbs just as he had taught. On one such journey, in a dusty village near the Greenblood, Sam found a girl dying of fever, her family resigned to loss. He brewed willow bark, cooled her brow, and whispered stories in her ear until her fever broke. Her parents wept, pressing coins and kisses to his hands. And Sam, who still blushed at praise, simply smiled and left behind more herbs, more knowledge. Before he departed, the girl tugged at his sleeve. Will you come again, Maester? If the gods are kind, little one. But remember, the healing is yours now. Teach it to the next who needs it. The work was never finished. Plague came some years, and drought others. In the Vale, a rockslide threatened to starve half a valley. Samwell coordinated relief, teaching locals to terrace the mountain seats, to trap water in stone cisterns. When banditry flared in the Stormlands, Sam organized a council of the local lords and the small folk, mediating a truce that held. Peace is not the absence of trouble, he told them, but the presence of understanding. There were setbacks. In Lannisport, a nobleman's pride led to a feud that spilled blood on the docks. In the Reach, a wet summer brought blight to the wheat. Sam took every problem as a lesson. He convened the first Grand Council of Healers, inviting maesters, midwives, hedge wizards, and even septons and septas. They shared what they knew, setting aside rivalries in the name of learning. The great hall of the Red Keep echoed with voices from every corner of Westeros, and Samwell, sitting quietly at the edge of it all, felt the world shifting, growing. Years passed. Gilly's hair turned silver. Sam's hands grew tremulous, but his mind remained a lantern in the dark. He taught, wrote, and comforted. When Gilly died, gentle and beloved by all, Sam grieved deeply but found solace in her legacy. Her gardens bloomed through every district of the city. Her apprentices brought flowers to her memorial every spring. Little Sam became Grand Maester after his father, his chain newly forged, heavy and proud. Samwell retired at last to the Maester's Keep, a small house on the banks of the Blackwater, filled with books and family. There, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren visited, asking endless questions. He was known as Old Sam by the children of the city, who gathered for stories of the wall in the north, of dragons and the day the dead walk. In the evenings, Sam sat on his porch and watched the city lights flicker, the river drifting quietly by. Sometimes he saw ghosts. Jon Snow standing atop the wall, a boy with fear in his eyes but courage in his heart. Grin and Ed laughing by the fire. Sansa crowned in winter sunlight. Arya's wild hair in the wind. He missed them, but knew they lived on, not just in memory, but in every life made better by his work. On the last day of his life, the bells rang out again. It was not for a king or queen, but for Samwell Tarly. Friend, healer, scholar, father. People gathered in every square, from Dorne to the Wall, sharing stories of the man who had healed not just bodies, but hearts. His grandchildren carried his codex to every corner of the realm, and each year, on the day of his passing, healers and scholars met in King's Landing to share their wisdom and honor his memory. For centuries after, the realm flourished. Children learned to read in every village. The sick found care no matter their birth. Lords governed with wisdom, and peace endured through drought and flood, storm and sorrow. All remembered the man who had healed the world not with steel or fire, but with compassion, knowledge, and the belief that every life was worth saving. And so the story of Samwell Tarly, Grand Maester, became more than legend. It became the pulse of the realm itself, a quiet promise, beating through the ages, that knowledge and kindness, above all, would endure. In the golden dusk of the new age, the Seven Kingdoms sang a quieter song. The old wounds of the land, softened by time and kindness. Samwell Tarly's legacy drifted through the streets and villages like a gentle spring breeze, subtle but ever-present. Most who lived in this world of peace and plenty had never seen war with their own eyes. The city walls were draped in vines, and the air above the Red Keep shimmered with birds. Small folk from distant towns arrived in King's Landing every week, drawn not by fear or famine, but by hope, the hope of knowledge, healing, and a place in a gentler future. It was a time of Samwell's great-grandchildren, and the world seemed impossibly large and full of promise to them. The Tarly Codex, now copied in 100 versions, was found in the satchels of midwives, on the shelves of septis, and even in the hands of hedge wizards who journeyed through the wild hills. In Old Town, a great hall had been built to house the Grand Conclave, where every 3 years, the learned folk of the realm gathered to share what they had discovered. The old squabbles over who should hold knowledge or withhold it had faded, replaced by something new, collaboration, a hunger for understanding rather than control. At the heart of this changed world stood Jonwell Tarly, great-grandson of Samwell, newly appointed as the youngest master healer ever to take the silver and bronze chain. His curly hair, dark as his namesake's, and his mother's freckles marked him as a child of many lineages. He carried the weight of his name like a badge and a responsibility, and as he walked the city streets, he found himself pausing to listen to every tale and trouble. It was in the Queen's School, now a sprawling complex with libraries, gardens, and sunlit dormitories, that Jonwell felt his grandfather's presence strongest. He taught anatomy and the mixing of medicines, and he watched the children, barefoot, bright-eyed, learning with a curiosity that filled him with quiet joy. When lessons ended, he wandered the gardens, finding solace among the rose bushes that Gilly had once planted, their blooms now running wild in the spring warmth. A storm came one summer, fierce and sudden, sweeping in from the narrow sea. For 3 days, the wind battered the city, tearing tiles from roofs and flooding the low markets. The Blackwater rose high on its banks, and by the time the skies cleared, half a dozen districts were underwater. Johnwell spent those days in the infirmary, sleepless, wading through streets ankle-deep in river muck, to tend to those stricken with chills and coughs. Old women with their legs swollen from cold, children shivering with fever. Johnwell's hands never faltered as he brewed teas, wrapped blankets, and whispered the same stories Samwell had once told. When at last the waters receded, the city rose from its beds and began again. Houses were rebuilt, markets reopened. The Queen, a young woman of the Baratheon line, arrived in muddy boots to thank every healer and builder in person. Her presence, warm and unpretentious, recalled Brienne's reign and brought out laughter even in the poorest corners. Johnwell found himself summoned to the keep. The council room was crowded. The Queen, her consort from Dorne, the masters of grain and ships, and the quiet voice of the faith. Johnwell bowed, feeling the eyes of the realm's rulers upon him. "My lords, my lady," he said, "the flood has revealed an old sickness in the city, one we have forgotten in these peaceful years. The fever spread not by malice or filth, but by water drawn from old wells beneath the ground. There are tales in the codex of such things from the days of the Dragon Kings. We must cleanse our water and teach the people how to keep it safe." The Queen nodded, her brow furrowed. "You have the council's trust, Maester Johnwell. What would you have us do?" Johnwell outlined a plan: a new aqueduct, repairs to cisterns, a system of public fountains. He asked for workers from every guild, for lessons in every school. It was a massive undertaking, but the city had learned to trust its healers. Within weeks, teams worked in every district. Johnwell oversaw the training of hundreds of apprentices, his heart swelling to see the youngest children carrying buckets of clean water, their mothers showing off their new well covers as badges of pride. It was not easy. Some of the old lords grumbled at the cost. There were a few outbreaks in the hills beyond the city, and Johnwell rode out with his satchel and herbs, traveling the muddy roads with his sisters. One a gardener, the other a scribe, teaching every hamlet the lessons his family had handed down. When at last the fever broke, and the city's water ran clear and sweet, there was a celebration. Banners were hung along the river, musicians played in the squares, and the Queen herself walked the length of the new aqueduct with Johnwell at her side, his chain shining in the sun. She toasted the healers and the builders, but reserved her highest praise for the people of the city, who had worked together, neighbor beside neighbor, to save themselves. On the steps of the Queen's school, Johnwell stood before the children and read aloud from the old codex. "No single hand can heal the world," he said, "but many hands together can do what even kings and dragons could not." The cheers echoed down the streets, and Johnwell looked to the sky, thinking of his great-grandfather and all of the gentle, quiet souls who had built the world anew. In the years that followed, the world changed again. Peace brought prosperity, and prosperity brought curiosity. Ships sailed from King's Landing and Old Town to distant coasts. Carthlis, even the fabled shores of Yt. Maesters traveled with them, carrying medicine and stories. Some never returned, but their letters and discoveries came back, filling the halls of the Grand Conclave with strange wonders. Seeds from fire poppies, tales of healers who spoke with birds, maps of rivers that ran backward in the east. Johnwell, now known as the Great Healer, presided over these councils. He brokered a treaty between rival houses in the Riverlands, healed a prince in Dorne who fell from a horse, and found time every spring to return to the gardens at the Queen's School, reading to the littlest children beneath the shade of the roses. When asked what he had learned in his travels, he always answered that the world is wide, and none of us can know all its secrets, but together we can make it gentler. Then he married a scribe from Old Town, wise, sharp-tongued, a lover of books, and together they raised a brood of children and fosterlings, each of whom found their own way in the world. Some became healers, some sailors, some teachers, but all carried the lessons of kindness and curiosity. Near the end of his days, Johnwell grew frail, his hair silvered, and his voice soft as a breeze. On his final journey he returned to Horn Hill, the old seat of House Tarley, now kept by distant cousins who welcomed him as a hero. There, he walked the gardens and woods his ancestor had once fled in fear, finding peace among the poplars and the long, quiet meadows. It was there, beneath the boughs of a spreading oak, that Samwell was visited by a group of children, wild as any from the city streets, and asked to tell a story. He told them not of dragons or battle, but of a Maester long ago, who had been afraid but had chosen, each day, to be brave enough to help. The children listened, their eyes wide, and Samwell knew in his bones that the story would outlive him. When Samwell died, his family gathered from every corner of the realm. They buried him in the gardens at Horn Hill, among the roses and thyme. The news traveled by raven and by song, and in every city, every village, a candle was lit in memory, not only for Samwell, but for all the healers, teachers, and dreamers who had come before. At the Grand Conclave, they recited the names of Samwell and Gilly, of little Sam and the Queen who had first opened the gates. And so, generation upon generation, the gentle light of healing was carried forward. In distant places, far beyond the boundaries of maps, the Tarly Codex found its way into strange hands and strange tongues, teaching new lessons and shaping new worlds. Children learned to read by lamplight. Mothers mended wounds with clean water and honey. Fathers taught their sons and daughters to listen first, to speak second, to help always. The Seven Kingdoms, at last, found not only peace, but a wisdom that endured. The legends of sword and dragon faded into myth, but the story of Samwell Tarly, his courage, his healing, his endless hope, remained, a lantern in the long night, bright and steadfast as the dawn. A.K. The golden days slipped into memory, as seasons cycled over the realm Samwell Tarly had helped to mend. Across the lands, fields burst with grain where war had once churned the soil to mud, and in the villages and cities, children grew up with ink-stained fingers and stories of peace on their tongues. Maesters, healers, and wise women crisscrossed the Seven Kingdoms, their journeys tracing invisible lines of connection, a great net of kindness and knowledge stretching from the frost fangs to the summer sea. Samwell's descendants, those of his blood, those of his teaching, and those who only knew his name from books, carried forward his vision. The Tarly Codex became not just a handbook for healers, but a kind of secret scripture, each new generation writing its own marginalia in cramped, eager script. It was in these layers, these footnotes, that the heart of the realm's healing could be found. A recipe altered to suit mountain herbs, a new method for keeping water sweet, an account of how one girl in a storm-tossed hamlet calmed a panicked crowd with only a steady voice, and a tale of Samwell's first long night at the wall. A century after Samwell's death, the world had changed more than he could have imagined. Castles that had once bristled with arms now rang with the clangor of forges making not swords but plows, printing presses, and the clever mechanisms of watermills. The Queen's School had grown into a sprawling academy. Students arrived from as far as Skagos and the Red Mountains, their dialects blending into a melody of curiosity. Some came to heal, others to study the arts of numbers, star lore, or the secret language of machines. The very stones of King's Landing seemed less forbidding. Flowers spilled from window boxes and banners fluttered in the bright breeze. Samwell Tarly's own granddaughter, Mara, wore the Maester's chain now, silver-haired, wise, and fierce. She presided over the Grand Conclave every 3 years, her voice clear and measured as she greeted the assembly. In her first years, she had faced challenges Samwell would have recognized: a blight in the riverlands, a fire in the wharves, old hatreds crackling at the margins of peace. Each time, she had gathered healers, workers, and wise folk, turning to the Codex, not as gospel, but as inspiration. In Mara's day, a new test arose. A bitter winter gripped the north, harsher than any in memory. The white knife froze over. Stores of grain dwindled. News arrived that the old road to White Harbor was blocked, and rumors swept south that the cold carried a sickness with it. Strange fevers, children trembling and burning with ice and fire at once. Mara convened the conclave in haste, their banners crowded into the high hall. She heard the worried voices, lords and merchants, wildlings from the gift, sisters from the faith who had nursed the sick at bedside and could not name the malady. There was talk of sending armies, of closing borders, of hoarding what food remained. But Mara remembered her grandfather's words, taught by her mother and her mother's mother before. No single hand can heal the world, but many together might. She proposed a new kind of journey. Instead of a single envoy, she called for 10 healers, builders, scholars, and story keepers, each from a different land, each carrying the knowledge of their people and the courage to learn anew. They would travel to the north, not to rule or command, but to listen, help, and teach. The company set forth in the brittle cold of early frost. Their names were soon sung in the halls of Winterfell and the campfires of White Harbor. Sarah, the glassmith's daughter who built greenhouses of ice and sun. Nim, a healer from Dorne who discovered a moss in the snows that soothed fevered brows. Isha, a wildling woman whose tales and patience coaxed children to eat when their strength was low. And the rest, each leaving a mark as small as a healing touch and as great as a bridge over. It was not swift, nor was it easy. The fevers raged and claimed some lives, but less than in winters past. The people of the north learned to build stoves that needed little wood, to trap warmth beneath blankets sewn with stories. For the first time, maesters and wise women worked side by side, learning each other's ways. When the ice at last retreated and the ships sailed up the White Knife, the north welcomed the new spring with a festival that echoed as far as the Summer Isles. Mara returned to King's Landing in triumph, but refused the honors offered. "It was not my wisdom," she told the queen, "but the will of the people, and the weaving together of old and new." With each passing decade, Samwell's vision became less a memory and more the marrow of the realm. Letters flowed between lands. Ships brought silks, books, and seeds. Printing presses worked day and night. In Dorne, the children of Snake and Sun told stories of a maester who rode the dunes with camels and a gentle tongue. In the Westerlands, lords opened new mines only with the blessing of healers, and miners kept codex pages pressed in pockets over their hearts. In the east, at the foot of the Painted Mountains, new villages bore names from the Tarly line: Samwell, Gilly, Johnwell, Mara. In times of hardship, the old fears sometimes rose again: drought, disease, the stubborn pride of ancient houses. But each time, the lessons of healing won the day, not through force or decree, but through the slow, certain change of hearts. Children raised on stories of peace grew into adults who chose not to lift the sword, but the pen or the plow. Even the faith, once wary of Maester's wisdom, learned to share and reconcile. Beyond the edges of the realm, word of the Seven Kingdoms healing traveled with merchant ships and pilgrims. Samwell's codex was translated into the tongues of Bravos and the Summer Isles, of Norvos and the Roinar cities. Some distant scholars dismissed it as simple, provincial wisdom. Others saw in its pages a blueprint for a better world. Mara herself journeyed across the sea in her old age, welcomed as an honored guest in the courts of Lys and Korth, where she spoke of the great weaving of knowledge and kindness. One summer, when Mara was well past 70, she returned to Horn Hill with her children and grandchildren. The estate had changed little. The stones of the old keep felt cool and ancient, the meadows wild with flowers and deer. She led the youngest to the garden, where Samwell and Gilly rested beneath a grove of old oaks. There, in the twilight, she told them the story of how a frightened boy ran from his father's anger, only to find courage in books and friends and love. "Remember this," she whispered, her voice carried by the soft evening wind. "The world can always break, but so too can it be mended, over and over, as many times as it takes." Then they planted a new oak that night, singing as the stars wheeled overhead. The roots twined with those of the old, the soil rich and deep. So the healing of the realm did not end. In every village, when trouble stirred or fear grew too heavy, someone would remember the tales of the Grand Maester who mended bodies and spirits, of his children and grandchildren, of the many hands who held the lamp and the pen. The world still knew loss and longing, but the darkness never returned as it once had. for in every heart there burned a small steady flame of hope. Centuries later, scholars would debate the turning point of Westeros, the moment when swords gave way to knowledge, when the scars of fire and betrayal became furrows for new seeds. But in the quiet places, in gardens and hearth-lit halls, old women would tell children the true secret. It began with a boy who learned that the greatest courage was the courage to heal. The lamp of Samwell Tarly, lit in fear and carried through the longest night, still shone on, a promise unbroken by the passing of ages. And in that gentle, stubborn light, the world, bruised and beautiful, was always being made new. Okay. The oaks in the garden of Horn Hill had grown mighty, their canopies interlacing to cast dappled gold across the stone graves of Samwell, Tarly, and Gilly. Each spring, wild roses unfurled along the winding paths, and children, descendants, students, wanderers, came from near and far to touch the weathered stones and whisper a promise to carry healing onward. It was said that on quiet nights, if you stood beneath those trees and listened, you could hear the laughter of the generations, the gentle murmur of stories told and retold until they shaped the world. The world had changed so profoundly that Samwell, had he woken from the sleep of ages, would have known it only by its people's kindness, not by its cities or its lords. Horn Hill itself, once a stronghold, had become a haven for learning and invention. Its libraries overflowed with volumes, the old Tarly Keep now wreathed in ivy and humming with students from every corner of the realm. The Codex, once a single tome, had blossomed into a vast collection. The books of healing, bound in many colors, filled with illustrations, local remedies, maps, and stories. Each was marked with the names of its contributors, so the wisdom belonged to all. A time of challenge descended once more, as it always must. The climate itself grew unpredictable. Drought in the Reach, fierce storms along the coasts, floods that swelled the Trident and sent refugees wandering south with only the clothes on their backs. In the high halls of the Grand Conclave, Mara's son Edric, now the Grand Maester, met with counselors and queens, arguing late into the night about grain stores, river management, and the rising threat of hunger. He was lean and long-fingered, with Gilly's warmth in his smile and Samwell's endless patience. It was Edric's daughter, Celia, barely more than a girl but already famed for her curiosity, who discovered the first true answer. She had been sent to the Riverlands to record stories of the flood, but she found instead a hidden valley where the villagers grew barley on floating rafts and fish swam through the wheat fields. Intrigued, Celia filled her sketchbook with diagrams, her journal with recipes and planting schedules, and hurried back to Horn Hill to share what she'd learned. The conclave, once cautious and slow, embraced her vision. They dispatched young scholars and gardeners to the river villages, blending what Celia had learned with the old science of aqueducts, dikes, and new plantings. For the first time in living memory, the Riverlands produced enough grain not only to feed its people, but to send stores north and west, blunting the edge of hunger. Celia's name became a watchword for hope and ingenuity, and the method, part old magic, part careful observation, spread even to the outer isles and the craggy foothills of Skagos. But not all trials could be solved by grain and learning. In Old Town, a new sickness swept the poorest quarters. A cough that rattled the lungs and a fever that burned away memory. The city's wise women were the first to notice its spread. The maesters responded quickly, isolating the sick, sending out calls for healers from every school. Edric, now stooped and silver-haired, took charge himself, living in the heart of the afflicted district with Celia by his side. For weeks, they worked together, studying the patterns of the disease. Celia devised a system of color-coded stones, green for safe, yellow for sick, red for those in quarantine. She made sure each family had a sign to hang by their door and trained children to deliver messages on long poles, so no one risked unnecessary contact. Her grandmother's stories echoed in her mind. Compassion is the cure for fear, knowledge the answer to darkness. It was in an old scroll, tucked between herbal recipes in the Tarly Codex, that Celia found the key. a description of an herb used in times of the Great Spring Sickness, centuries before. The herb, fever leaf, was rare, growing only in shaded glens in the Stormlands. Celia wrote to the Lords of Storm's End, and soon, parties of children, knights, and wise women scoured the forests, gathering the precious leaves. Boiled into a bitter tea, it soothed the cough and steadied the fever. Gradually, the sickness retreated, leaving the city wiser, kinder, and more grateful. In the aftermath, the Queen of Westeros journeyed to Old Town, not with her guard, but with her children and her own teachers. She asked Celia to walk with her through the healed streets, listening to the stories of those who had survived. They visited the poorest houses, the schools and gardens, and at the end, the Queen addressed the city from the steps of the citadel. Once, we ruled by fear and sword. She said. Her voice carrying over the crowd. But now we are kept safe by care. By the courage to learn and teach, the city celebrated for a week. Lanterns floating on the honey wine, stories sung late into the night. Celia, overwhelmed by praise, returned to Horn Hill to tend her garden and teach her younger cousins. But her name was spoken with love and awe in every corner of the land. As the years flowed on, the innovations of Westeros multiplied. Floating gardens thrived on rivers and lakes. Public fountains brought clean water to the poorest villages. The arts of healing, farming, and engineering were taught side by side. The conclave admitted not just maesters, but wise women, green seers, even singers and storytellers. No one was turned away for birth or faith or gender. The Queen's School became a gathering place for all who wished to learn, and every spring, students planted new trees in the memory of those who had gone before. Horn Hill became the heart of this world, a place of pilgrimage for those seeking wisdom, healing, or simply hope. The graves of Samwell and Gilly grew thick with flowers, their names worn smooth by the touch of countless hands. Each year, on the anniversary of the long night's end, children gathered in the twilight, lanterns cupped in their palms, listening as the elders told stories. Celia, in her old age, would often sit beneath the oaks, her lap filled with little ones. She taught them how to listen for the heartbeat of the earth, how to tell a story that comforted as well as inspired, how to brew a fever leaf tea, and how to recognize the difference between pride and wisdom. When at last Celia died, her ashes were scattered among the roots of the oldest oak, mingling with the soil that had once cradled Samwell and Gilly. Her family and students gathered not in mourning, but in gratitude and joy, planting a ring of wild roses to bloom every spring. Time rolled onward, each generation rising, learning, faltering, and rising again. The names of Samwell and Gilly, Jonwell and Mara, Edric and Celia, became threads in a tapestry too vast for any one person to see. Yet the spirit of healing remained, in every village garden, every schoolhouse, every hall where people gathered to share wisdom and break bread. Long after the old banners faded, the lamp of the Tarlys burned on, a quiet promise to all the realm. A promise that no matter what darkness might come, there would always be hands ready to heal, minds eager to learn, and hearts open to hope. And so, in the gentle shade of the oaks and the riot of wild roses, Westeros endured, not with the roar of dragons or the march of armies, but with the undying song of compassion, wisdom, and peace. Oh, Kai, Ka. The realm drifted deeper into its era of gentle progress. Centuries after Samwell Tarly's first lamp was lit, the land was still marked by rivers and mountains, by the skeletons of ancient castles, and by the bustling cities that had grown up beside them. But now, the roads that threaded through fields and forests were traveled more by wagons bearing books, seeds, medicines, and letters than by knights with banners or soldiers in mail. Trade and curiosity outpaced old feuds, and the legend of the Grand Maester was as integral to the realm's soul as any tale of Aegon or the old kings of winter. At Horn Hill, the season spun with steady purpose. The wild rose hedge surrounding the Tarly graves thickened with age, as each generation left offerings: a child's painted stone, a pressed flower, a page from a well-thumbed book of healing. Students arrived on foot, on pony, even by riverboat to begin their apprenticeships. Here, the air itself seemed charged with a kind of reverence, not for the nobility of blood, but the nobility of effort and kindness. Children from the Reach, the North, the Isles, even the lands beyond the narrow sea learned together, taught by scholars and wise women, singers and healers, in a dozen languages and dialects. Aaron Tarley, the current warden of the books, oversaw the gathering of knowledge and the peace of Horn Hill. Erin's hair was black as night and worn cropped for practicality. Her hands, always ink-stained, were as gentle as the first rain after drought. Each evening, she walked the gardens, carrying a lantern whose glass was etched with scenes from Samwell's life. A wolf on a snowy field, a maester in a library, a gentle hand cradling a wounded bird. The council at Horn Hill met weekly. It was a raucous assembly: healers, riverfolk, inventors, poets, and gardeners, each bringing reports of their work. Some weeks the talk was of new grafted apple trees that bore fruit twice in a season. Sometimes it was of a new system for teaching letters by song, or a clever contraption that could draw clean water from the deepest wells. No subject was too humble, no invention too small. Their philosophy was simple and enduring. Every improvement in the life of one person made the whole realm stronger. One crisp autumn day, the great bell of Horn Hill rang thrice, signaling a visitor from afar. A delegation had arrived from the Free Cities, led by a scholar from Volantis named Marianne. She brought tidings of a disease sweeping through the slums of the Roynar quarter, a strange wasting sickness that confounded the best apothecaries. Her companions were an unlikely company: a Bravosi hedge doctor, a Lycene alchemist, a Norvosi herbalist, and 2 freedmen from Old Volantis. Aaron welcomed them, as tradition demanded, with bread, honey, and the peace of the oaks. That night, in the great hall, she gathered her council and the visitors to share their stories and observations. The atmosphere buzzed with the thrill of challenge and the hope of cooperation. Children and elders alike sat cross-legged by the hearth, listening as Marianne described the symptoms: fevers, rashes, the wasting of limbs, and the failures of their own remedies. Aaron and the Horn Hill healers asked questions, eager to learn. They compared notes and samples, tested remedies late into the night. Aaron herself worked alongside the Norvosi and Bravosi, her mind ticking through combinations of native Westerosi herbs and the imported medicines from the Free Cities. For weeks, the gardens and workshops of Horn Hill rang with experiment and debate. Mistakes were made, but every failure was catalogued, lessons recorded in the ever-growing volumes of the books of healing. At last, one late night in the herbarium, Aaron's apprentice, an unassuming girl named Pippa from the Riverlands, noticed a similarity between the wasting sickness and an old description in the Codex of a fever from the times of the Andals. The passage, written in Samwell's looping hand, described a tea made from the bark of the willow root, combined with a rare moss that grew on the north face of oaks. With Marianne's help, they tested the old remedy, blending it with a syrup distilled by the Lycene alchemist. Within days, the afflicted among the delegation showed marked improvement. The news spread swiftly by raven and riverboat. Horn Hill dispatched ships, loaded with dried willow bark and moss cakes, alongside teachers and herbalists trained to recognize the first signs of the wasting fever. The Roynar quarter's crisis faded, and Volantis sent thanks and rare tomes in return. From this episode, the council at Horn Hill declared that all new remedies be tested in partnership, recorded in at least 3 languages, and that no land or people was too remote or poor to merit attention. This principle became known as the third rule of healing. There are no strangers in illness, nor in learning. It was inscribed over every apothecary and schoolhouse built thereafter, and repeated in the lullabies of nurses from the Shield Islands to Sunspear. Generations spun onward. Each era brought fresh trials, lean harvests, surges of fever, storms that battered the coast or toppled ancient bridges. Yet, again and again, the realm turned to its healers and scholars. who turned in turn to the lessons passed down by Samwell and his kin. When the great library at Old Town burned in a lightning storm, hundreds of students and villagers formed a living chain, passing books and scrolls from hand to hand until most were saved. When a strange new pestilence struck children in White Harbor, Hornhill's council sent healers north, and the people of the city opened their homes, remembering the generosity of the South in times past. Erin lived to see her 100th year, honored as a founder of the modern world. On her last day, she walked the gardens at dusk. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, some by blood, most by love and teaching, gathered at her side. She left them with only one charge: keep your minds open and your hands gentle. Remember the smallest kindness, for it outlives even the grandest monument. Menderand. After her passing, the Hornhill lantern was hung from the highest branch of the oldest oak. Each spring, at the gathering of the conclave, healers and scholars from across the world came to walk the garden paths, to listen to new discoveries, to recite the old tales and plant saplings in honor of the dead. In distant places, across the narrow sea, in the free cities, even on ships bound for lands only half-mapped, sailors and wanderers recited the parable of Samwell Tarly, how one gentle, fearful boy grew into a beacon, and how the lamp he lit was carried far beyond the borders of his home. It was told in many tongues, with details shifting as storytellers saw fit. But the truth remained: peace and healing were not the birthright of kings, but the work of many hands. Each life touched a stone in the great foundation of the realm. So the world turned, always mending, always learning. In times of darkness, children sat beneath blooming oaks and recited the old rules. Fear closes the mind, kindness opens the heart, and knowledge is the bridge that endures. The realm was never free of trouble, for no world could be. But where once swords and sorrow ruled, there now stood gardens, books, and hands ready to heal. Living proof that Samwell Tarly's lamp, once lit against the long night, would never fade. By the turn of another century, the wild gardens and groves of Hornhill had spread far beyond the manor's old stone walls, flowing like a green tide through the valleys and over the low hills. Orchards that had once belonged to a single house now fed 100 villages. Children learned to swim in the gentle bends of the stream beneath willow boughs planted by Samwell Tarly's grandchildren. And on clear evenings, the lantern light of the Scholars' Hall glimmered out across the meadows, like a constellation descended to earth. The Book of Healing, now simply called the Common Codex, had grown into a living compendium, its wisdom continually revised by the hands of the realm's most curious and compassionate minds. At every village fair and town market, traveling healers told the story of its beginnings. A boy once shamed for his softness had been the first to understand that knowledge could outlast cruelty, and that courage sometimes meant refusing to give pain for pain. In these peaceful times, the office of the Grand Maester was no longer tethered to King's Landing or Old Town. The conclave traveled from city to city, hosted in turn by the Lords of Winterfell, Sunspear, and Gulltown, and once every decade by the folk of Hornhill, whose hospitality was famed across the world. Each gathering was a festival of joy and remembrance, with games for the children, performances by wandering singers and mummers, and debates that drew crowds to every square. The youngest apprentices and the oldest wise women traded questions and answers, and the best of their discoveries: how to coax apples from stony ground, how to comfort a grieving widow, how to mend a broken wheel or a broken heart, were entered into the Codex. Among the apprentices in this golden age was Lysara, a descendant of the Tarlys through the line of Celia. Lysara's hair was thick and chestnut, her skin bronzed by the sun and wind. She was restless and daring, more inclined to climb a tree than to read in a window. But when she did read, she read with a hunger that astonished her teachers. Her favorite lesson was always the same: that healing was not only about the body, but about listening. To the land, to the old, to the outcast, to the frightened child. On the morning of her 16th name day, Lysara left Horn Hill for the wide world. She carried only a leather satchel stuffed with dried herbs, a copy of the Codex inscribed with her mother's hand, and a little glass lamp in the shape of an acorn. Her first destination was the far coast of the Vale, where rumors had reached the conclave of a new sickness. Children who fell into long sleeps, their breathing shallow and strange, their dreams troubled by shadows. The roads east were busy with trade. Barges loaded with fruit and cloth plied the rivers, and on every bridge, Lysara saw travelers from distant lands, summer islanders with bright scarves, Brevosi merchants, even a few blue-lipped warlocks from Quarth hoping to buy books or marvels for their libraries. She traveled with a band of other apprentices, sleeping in haylofts, sharing bread with millers and minstrels, always listening for stories. In the valleys of the Fingers, she helped to birth calves and taught a farmer's son to set a broken arm. On the high road to the Eyrie, she learned the song of the wind in the pines and how to cure a cough with boiled pine needles and honey. When at last she reached the afflicted village, a cluster of stone houses on the bluffs above the narrow sea, she found the people exhausted and weary. The healers had tried all the usual remedies, but nothing worked. Lysara spent her first nights by the bedside of the sickest child, a girl called Brina, who twisted and moaned in troubled sleep. Lysara sang the old lullabies and kept a record of the child's dreams. She spoke gently with the parents, learning the patterns of their days, what had changed before the sickness struck. It was the village well that gave her pause. The water, she noticed, had a faint, sour tang. On the third morning, Lysara lowered a lantern into its depths and saw the shimmer of strange silken roots writhing in the blackness. Drawing on the wisdom of the Codex, and a story she recalled from Celia's days, she realized these were the tendrils of a rare water plant, harmless in itself but capable, when decayed, of leaching a sleeping draught into the water. With the help of the villagers, Lysara dredged the well and boiled the water in great iron kettles. She taught them how to filter it with river stones and charcoal, and soon the children began to wake. Brina, weak but smiling, reached for Lysara's hand and said, "Will you tell me a story?" The tale Lysara told was the story of Samwell and the long night, and the promise that no night lasted forever. When she finished, she left her little glass lamp with Brina and set out again. Her journey took her to Gulltown, where a fever raged among the dockworkers, and to Dorne, where drought had left whole orchards stunted and bitter. In every place, Lysara used the Codex, but she also listened to the wisdom of the local healers. She learned of plants that bloomed only at night, of poultices made from the sap of desert trees, of prayers sung to the sun that seemed to ease the pain of those near death. Every lesson she gathered, she wrote in the blank pages at the back of her Codex. As Lysara's reputation grew, so did the willingness of the world to learn. Sailors carried her remedies home to distant ports. The council at Horn Hill dispatched teams of healers to follow the path she blazed, recording and sharing new methods in every tongue. At the next conclave, Lysara was welcomed as a teacher in her own right, though she still wore the plain brown cloak of an apprentice. She stood before the gathering, scholars and gardeners, children and elders, even a Septon and a Roinar priestess from the east, and told them what she had learned. We begin with books and teachers, but the world is always wider than our lessons. Listen to the land. Listen to each other. Every hurt has its remedy, and every remedy begins with a question. The applause echoed through the halls, and after the festival, Lysara returned to Horn Hill for a season. There, she was welcomed by Erin's daughter Mael, now the head of the council. Together, they reviewed the latest discoveries. A grain that thrived in brackish soil, a method for curing wounds with silver dust and beeswax, a new lullaby sung in 3 languages. Yet even as peace and learning flourished, darkness stirred in the corners of the realm. In the far north, storms grew stronger. The summer snows lingered, and some whispered of shadows moving in the long twilight. Refugees came from the haunted woods, speaking of strange shapes and lights above the barrows. The old stories, once comfort, began to be retold in fear. The council at Horn Hill debated the stories with care. Some said it was only the turn of seasons, others that a new sickness lay waiting. Lysera, restless as ever, volunteered to journey north and see for herself. She traveled beyond Winterfell, following the old King's Road past Last Hearth to the edge of the world. In the twilight villages, she listened to the elders and to the silence of the snows. She found the shadows were only the tricks of the half-light, but the cold was real, and with it came a fever that sapped strength and hope. Lysera worked beside the wildling healers, learning their ways, sharing her own. The fever abated, but she saw that the land itself was changing. Ice creeping farther each year, the winds growing sharper. She wrote to Horn Hill, urging the council to prepare for harder times, to gather seeds, to teach new methods of building shelter, to remember that every age has its long night and that each must be faced with patience and unity. Her letter became the first page in a new volume of the Codex, the Book of Endurance. It would grow in time to guide the realm through coming storms. And so, as autumn leaves turned the world to gold, Lysera rode south, lamp at her side, ready to teach the next generation that the greatest hope is the one that endures through every darkness. The world would change again and again, but wherever a lamp was lit against the night, or a gentle hand soothed a fevered brow, the story of Samwell Tarly and all who followed him would live on, endlessly renewed in every act of healing, every lesson learned, every heart that dared to hope.